jaysanalysis.com. We're back. Time to discuss Book 3 of Plato's Republic. The first half of this lecture is, of course, free for those online in the cyber world, the world of the ether and the forms. And for those who are interested in going deeper and getting the full lecture, check out jaysanalysis.com, where I have the subscription button, and I'll send you a link to all the archives of the full material and the full lectures, full debates, full metaphysical discussions, talks, interviews, and so on. A wealth of stuff building up there over the last year. And this is material that you're not going to get from your average alternative media site. This is in-depth philosophical analysis where we're actually looking at the classics. So rather than jumping into alternative media without a foundation in learning and understanding classical pedagogy, education, what we're going to do is, as we've been doing, start with Western classics, and that is, of course, Plato's Republic at this point. Previously, we did several of Plato's dialogues. And as this continues on throughout the rest of this year, we will finish the Republic and hit other dialogues. And of course, there are plenty of Platonic works in the corpus that need to be touched on that are worth discussing. Ultimately, hopefully, we will hit every one of them. So we're now to Book 3 of the Republic, and as we saw in Book 2, we discussed the magical ring and the secret society and elite philosophers and the guardian class and so forth. And this book is going to focus on more of the structure of the ideal republic and the question of aesthetics, the art, music, musical harmonies, and what I call the mathematical state, the rational state. So we're going to look at the question of the anthropocosmic principle or the micro-macro principle. We're going to look at the myth of the metals, which will tie into alchemy and metallurgy, and how this relates to the faculties in the human as Plato conceives of them from Pythagoreanism and his metaphysics and his anthropology, and as well how it applies to the larger social sphere and ultimately, as we know from the Timaeus, to the entire universe. So these are all important, crucial features for understanding Platonism. And as we progress, it's going to get really, really deep as we get into books 4, 5, and 6. 6 is particularly metaphysical, so we're going to look forward to that. But Book 3 is almost equally as metaphysical, where we're going to see more about the noble lie, that is the state-controlled mythos, state-controlled created religion. We're going to see some fascinating parallels with the usage of what's called the Phoenician story. And this is the same thing as the noble lie. But we will see from the noble lie curious parallels to modernity's versions of the noble lie. We'll see curious parallels to Brave New World, which in the near future I will be doing an in-depth analysis of Huxley's Brave New World as well. So here with Book 3, we're going to start with the question of gods and heroes and that guardian class, as we mentioned before. So this pyramidal triadic structure of the ideal republic has at its base the workers, the worker bees, working class, the plebes, the proletariat. Above them, the guardian class, your enforcers, soldiers, police, the elite soldier class. And of course above them, which will not be mentioned yet until later books, above the guardian class we'll have, of course, the philosopher king. And so this model is triadic in structure because for Platonism, triads and trinities are crucial. The beginning of geometry, the beginning of metaphysics is, of course, the one or the monad that then projects forth, it emanates forth a line. So you have a dot, the monad, you have a line extending from it. This is the dyad because you have an extension in space. And then you have from that a further extension, which will create the triad. And the triad, of course, gives us a plane. So we went from a single point in space to a line, and then from there we get a plane. So that with that we have one-dimensional reality. When we add another triad to this, we begin to incorporate two-dimensional reality. So now we have two planes that intersect at a corner, and we're starting to build up our dimensions of reality. And this is how the world is actually constructed in this Pythagorean geometrical form. So for Plato, this is going to apply obviously to the state. The state will also need to be constructed in a rational, coherent, mathematical way. The mathematical state, the ideal state. Music will play into this because music is involved in terms of harmony. So harmonies in music only sound right in a certain way. When the certain pitch, the certain notes are played together, they're harmonious. When they're not, it's disharmonious. It sounds like Nirvana or something. So mathematics, of course, music is math and time, right? As we know from the quadrivium. And geometry is math and space. So these two seemingly disparate fields of music and spatial geometry are actually interrelated because they both have the unifying factor of math. And math and numbers, of course, are going to play into the Republic in a crucial way in terms of how we will build up from the visible realm to the realm of the forms through numbers and mathematics. So the present level of reality, which for Platonism is constructed of passing phantasms, shadows, forms, the realm of becoming, flux, change. This leads us to unifying principles behind all this, which are, as Dr. Farrell calls, topological. So these topological geometric and mathematical principles unify all the different aspects of what we see in our reality. For example, in the book of Sirach, the deuterocanonical book of the scriptures, there is the text that God measured and weighed all things according to number. So a similar idea out of the Alexandrian tradition of Judaism, the Philonic tradition, which is very influenced by Platonism. So when we think of that walking up the scale, if you will, from our level of reality to mathematics, unifying everything through geometry, through number, for Plato, that then leads to the forms. So I suppose there could be some debate as to whether the numbers themselves constitute formal reality or whether they're in some way numeric representations of higher level forms. But that's a different question, a deeper question that we'll perhaps look at later. But for now, back to the Guardians and the attack on Homer. So we're going to look at Iliad, Odyssey, the theology, the theos presented in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and whether for Socrates this is a healthy presentation or whether it needs to be corrected. The attack on Homer. Socrates, of course, views himself as a new Homer, the true Homer, and not Homer Simpson. I mean Homer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Why would that be? Well, in his mind, the arts are very dangerous. So aesthetics is not something that can be left up to the will of the masses. It has to be controlled because you can have revolution, uprising, decay, destruction, the loosing of the forces of libido through aesthetics, through the arts. And so they have to be monitored, they have to be watched very closely. At least that's Socrates' view. And the reason for that is because of the stories that the arts will tell about the gods. The stories that the arts tell have to be constructed in a certain way such that the people don't believe ridiculous things about the gods. Because if they believe ridiculous things about the gods, who are kind of archetypes of how humans ought to act, humans will inevitably act ridiculous. They'll act in accord with vice and not in accord with virtue. So Hades cannot be pictured as something scary and deadly. Hades has to be pictured as something to embrace in the sense of not fearing death, as we saw from the early Platonic discussions and lectures. Do not speak of hell or Hades as something scary. Cocytus, Styx, these are not the underworld. These are not things to be feared. They're the inevitable end of all. Of course, naturally, if you're unvirtuous, you will have something to fear. But in terms of the narratives of the stories that will be given in Socrates, Plato's version of Homer, they're going to be censored. And this book will focus mainly on the guardian class, right? So this is not about the masses or the philosopher kings. This is that middle level of the guardian class, and it's the guardian class that will learn the arts. So because of his perspective on harmony, the middle grade of the classes will need to be in harmony with things like music, poetry, and warfare, all of which are, in a way, arts. So they require this training and this perfecting to become the complete guardian. This is the Callipolis, and the Callipolis is the republic, the ideal city, as we said in the Greek. The luxurious city, which has now been purified in the sense of it's now becoming more complete, moving into the more ideal form, because initially we've dealt with the bottom rung of the pyramid, which are the masses, the plebeians, proletariat, and they're sort of the bronze in the metallurgical analogy. Moving up from them is the silver, and the silver are the guardians, this guardian class. He calls them the base level people are the money-loving producers. The guardians are the honor-loving guardians, so they're concerned with virtue. But we've still not yet moved to the top of that pyramid, which is philosopher king, Platonic philosophers. But for the guardian class, who are our sentry, our soldiers, self-control is their main focus. Not philosophy, not making money, but the arts in the sense of warfare, music, poetry, and self-control. Self-control is the beginning of virtue for Socrates, for the philosopher, because all the other virtues will flow from this. And so, as we saw in the earlier dialogue, self-control is that reining in of the passions. The bodily passions, sex, food, pleasures, etc. These are the things that are the baser desires in the Platonic view. And so in the three-tiered analogy, they would correspond to the masses, the working masses, right? That does not mean they don't have self-control, but they're less expected to have self-control to the degree that the guardian class is expected to have self-control. And so the guardian class is going to be governed by honor, courage, harmony, right? These higher level virtues than the virtues of the working class. Nevertheless, all still need self-control. That's the beginning point for virtue in all the classes. And as we said, the way to make sense of this structure, this triad, is what's called by some the anthropocosmic principle or the macro-microcosm principle. And that's just simply that there's a correspondence, we might say, between these seemingly different things, right? The social structure seems to be different from an individual, and that seems to be different from the metallurgical process of purifying metals and grades of metals, and that seems to be different from the structure of the universe, and it seems to be different from the geometrical abstract triangle or triad. And in a way they are, because they're different things. But for Platonism, all of those things have a correspondence because they all have an original monadic unitive origin. So the origin point of all things is in the Platonic view from the one. And because all things are measured by number, all things can be classed and grouped together through this commonality of correspondence. And so that's how we can get to the idea that the human body corresponds to the ideal republic, because the human person has the same triadic structure as does the city, the republic. Body, spirit or soul, and then nous or reason. That's the three-part structure. And this corresponds to the body being the working classes, focused on bodily desires. The guardian classes focused on spirit or soul, virtue, courage, etc. And then the philosopher king, of course, focused on reason, logos, logic. So that is crucial to understanding Platonism and understanding this version, this Greek version of this tradition. Because, of course, it does go back to Egypt. It has an Egyptian pedigree, we learn in the Timaeus. So that is why music, then, cannot have free reign in the Republic with no sense of harmony, order, with no censorship. Because if music runs free, it becomes a degenerating, passion-driven, irrational force. And that is antithetical to the nature of what Plato sees in the ideal republic. And it's just as irrational to have, say, democracy, where everything's chaotic and it leads to anarchy and oligarchy, according to Plato, as it is to have dissonance in music, right? It doesn't sound right to have a bunch of just random notes playing. It sounds like noise. And so in the same way, a revolutionary, chaotic social order is like noise in the social order. It's a destructive force. It doesn't promote harmony, virtue, hierarchy, a hieratic structure. And yet, we all know that music, especially in the sense of classically trained musicians, is all grounded in mathematical order and timing, perfection, notes at the right time, notes played in harmony, and instruments played together in harmony, right? And this demonstrates to us order. So we can see this in pop culture insofar as the dominant music, quote unquote, that's out there is irrational, disharmonious, full of dissonance, and very base in its focus and in its drive. That would be, for Plato, a perfect example of how aesthetics is not something, for example, in this era, we have this mistaken notion in the arts in general that anything goes, right? It's just artistic expression is a complete freedom from any restrictions, man. Nothing could be further from the truth in the Platonic view. There's objective standards in art because there are objective standards for beauty. And this should be something kind of innate that we sense, something obvious to us. It should be clear that there's an objective distinction between ugliness and the beautiful. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some gray area and room for tastes. We all have a different palette, different preferences. Nevertheless, even in the midst of that, for example, with human beauty, there are tests that have been done that men, for example, overwhelmingly prefer a slimmer, attractive type of female. So a female, for example, that is grossly overweight is objectively less attractive to the majority of human males. Why? Well, it's just plain nature, because someone grossly overweight, for example, grossly obese, shows signs of not caring for themselves, right? So they already portray themselves as a not fit mate, right? Not fit for carrying on the progeny of the species. And then in the same way, the appearance itself is just simply aesthetically not pleasing, and that's just objectively a fact. Now, granted, there's some gray area there, because, you know, some men might prefer a little more meat, some guys might prefer, you know, a skinnier babe, but nevertheless, there are studies that have shown this principle to be objectively the case, empirically. And that would chime in well with the Platonic view. It would harmonize well with the Platonic view. So for Plato, there is this sense when we talk of the gods as there's a kind of esoteric view and an exoteric view of the gods for the people. And this is going to be important for understanding Platonism. So the exoteric view is the way that the masses kind of have a superstitious view of the gods in Plato's perspective, right? So they view the gods like people. So they're subject to all the same passions, and there's rape and there's murder and all these crazy things amongst the gods. But for Platonism, because ultimately these gods refer to higher mathematical and geometric principles, Plato says, do you think that such things make for self-control in young people? Talking about the rampant vice amongst the stories of the gods in Homer. Or what about having Zeus, when all other gods are asleep and he alone is awake, easily forget his plans because he has sexual desire for Hera? So Plato sees this as ridiculous. This is not befitting of what we say of the gods, and this is part of the reason he would like to see Homer censored in the Republic. This will later become normative in Eastern and Greek theology of God, insofar as he's spoken of as apatheia, from which modern derivation produces the word apathy. But apathy is not a good translation, because it doesn't mean that, at least in, say, Eastern Christian theology, it doesn't mean that there's no love in God or actual concern or compassion for his creation. It simply means that God's not subject to passions in the way that a fallen human would be. So there's a little bit of that same idea here in Plato, where he doesn't want to portray something unbefitting of the gods. Because, as we said, this would lead the people to act in a way inappropriate to both human nature and to the gods, right? Not according to reason and order. The gods do not have love of money. They're not avaricious or greedy. So people will excuse themselves if they see these sins in the gods, and so that's why that can't be allowed. So art then has to be strictly mimetic, is the Greek word, and this means copy. It can't be free reign. It has to be an accurate mirroring of things. So this is because of the status of our level of reality mirroring the realm of the forms. And so the best art then should mirror the real. And ultimately the real is the forms. And that would then mean that art has to be dominated by this same rational mathematical principle. So you ought to have form, structure, harmony in all forms of art, and not dissonance and lasciviousness. So we might say it's a kind of rigid realism in the arts. And for music, the mode and the rhythm must fit the words. It must do so because there is an effect on the soul. And so what this means is that there's only two kinds of music that will be allowed. He says, I don't know all the musical modes. Just leave me the mode that would most suitably imitate the tone and rhythm of a courageous person, a person active in battle or doing other violent deeds, who is failing and facing wounds, death, or some other misfortune, and who in all these circumstances is fighting off his fate steadily with self-control. Leave me also another mode, that of someone engaged in a peaceful, unforced, voluntary action, persuading someone or asking a favor of a god in prayer, or a human being through teaching and exhortation, or on the other hand, of someone submitting to the supplications of another. So these are the two modes that are allowed. There shouldn't be multi-stringed instruments, and then instruments and not flutes, because for Plato, the mythology of Athena constructing a flute and then discarding it, and then the centaurs, Pan, right, satyrs, they pick up the flute because it's a passion-based instrument. So we'll have none of that. Thus, we can have only Apollonian instruments, so to speak. The lyre and the cithara are left then as useful in the city, while in the country there would be some sort of pipe for the shepherds to play. So, sort of weird, what's the word I'm looking for here? Arbitrary, ad hoc, strange delineations of which instruments are allowed. After Athena had invented the flute, she discarded it because it distorted her features. It was picked up by the satyr Marsyas, who was foolish enough to challenge Apollo to a musical contest. So because satyrs are bestial in their behavior and their sexual desires, we will have none of that, as I said. Rhythm has to be regulated, good and bad rhythms. No evil crafts. Can't have any of that. Music must be simple and noble, whatever that means per se. The aesthetic theory then applies across the board to all crafts. And we can only have crafts that exalt virtue. Each virtue has its corresponding vice That's what we must keep in mind. If someone's soul has a fine and beautiful character and his body matches it in beauty and thus in harmony, so that both share in the same pattern, wouldn't that be the most beautiful sight for anyone who has eyes to see? Yes, it is. Well, then, therefore, this same principle must apply across the board, as we said. That doctrine of correspondences. The weird section about young boys here is important to note because, at least here, Plato does not like the idea of young boys and old men having any sexual interaction. The relationship should always be fatherly in a pure sense. So we'll have none of that pedo stuff at this point. No erotic relationships between older men and young boys. So good here. Guardians, however, will be like trained attack dogs. Our warrior elite, so to speak, the athletes, they need a more sophisticated kind of training. They must be like sleepless hounds, able to see and hear as keenly as possible, to endure frequent changes of water and food, as well as summer and winter on their campaigns without faltering in health. And as we said, this is the guardian class is what's under discussion here in Book 3. But they also mustn't have an excessive narcissistic care of the body, because that can be too distracting from the contemplation of truth. Even though the guardian class is not contemplating truth in forms directly in the same way that the philosopher kings will, those who have direct access to reason and then to the forms, the guardian class is still expected to focus on the higher, right? So they're still expected to focus on the virtues of courage, bravery, etc. These then are still higher than the body. And so any sort of narcissistic obsession over weightlifting or any of that, as we see in modern day thought, is viewed as lower and out of order. So the order of things is reversed in our day, according to Plato, where everyone is mainly concerned about their body and absolutely no concern about anything higher, anything rational, anything beyond the basest desires. And thus do not be too concerned with the body, he says. There will be a balance then for the guardians, a harmony of body and soul. Reason and music will help promote this as it comes down the chain from the top of the pyramid. Rulers will go through testings. They will be severely tested to attain this position of guardians. They are the elite, of course. So you have to weed out the weak. And part of the mythology that will be needed for the Republic is to have this exoteric fake religion. And this is a very crucial, important part of Platonism in the Republic. And it's interesting to note that it's a Phoenician story that's the beginning of what we call the noble lie, or the useful lie. This is the idea that the civic state must have some religious mythology to unify the masses. And yeah, it'll involve deception. And so here it's actually a Mother Earth deception. Yes, Gaia will be the lie of the exoteric religion, because it is explicitly stated it will be indoctrinated into the guardian class that Mother Earth, Gaia, gave birth to them. So they're the sons of Mother Earth, and therefore they must defend the motherland as their mother. But note that this is all a lie. And this is for the silver class of the guardians, not the gold of the philosopher kings, and not the iron or bronze of the masses. Although the masses may, of course, be indoctrinated in some exoteric, superstitious version of this fake religion. But this is where the alchemical aspect of this comes into play, because here he begins to discuss the gold and the silver and the iron and bronze in terms of the levels of people in this city. The levels of their reason and understanding. The workers, they're the bronze. They're never going to understand anything beyond their level of reality. They're in their own blue collar factory worker bubble, right? Don't ever expect them to understand the guardian class. Don't ever expect them to grasp the realities of philosophy, the forms, mathematical mysteries. And that harkens back to the Apology, as we saw early on, where when Socrates goes about Athens and he asks the different classes of persons, the different tradesmen, craftsmen, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of your craft? Explain this to me. And they all think that everything revolves around their little world. So if you're a shipbuilder, well, shipbuilding is the most important thing, and the whole world is viewed through the lens of shipbuilding, and all of which very simplistic, not true, but the shipbuilder thinks he's the wisest man on earth. And that's, of course, the irony of the Apology. Here, we're looking at it from a God's eye view, if you will, that the state-controlled mythos is necessary for the well-maintenance of the state. This will also play into the ancient Greek view of eugenics or race hygiene, insofar as it was connected to the idea of the noble lie. The population of the Republic has to be monitored and kept in balance. You can't have too many people getting Mother Earth, Gaia, out of balance. So the population has to be cold, kept into a certain framework. Everything in its proper place, as we say. So the noble lie then puts a strata of society together, held in unison by a religious scam. And it's necessary because there are gold, silver, and bronze people. This hierarchy is rigid, and not all these people are going to have access to philosophy. Thus, democracy, which is the inversion of this, is no good. This is Plato's line of thought. The elites, this guardian class, they are communal. They don't live like the masses, and they're not going to live even like the philosopher kings. The guardian class has everything in common. They have sex with whom they want, share wives, share goods, because they can't be attached to possessions. That would make them like the worker bees, and that's not fitting for this class of soldier types. They only get a small amount of any sort of wealth. Money goes back to the workers, and this allows the guardian class to focus on the virtues proper to their state. So they don't have private property. So every element of the society will perform its proper function, and this will be in harmony, and this will be justice. So this is the idea of justice being blind, holding the scales, the famous statue, the scales of justice, because it's in balance, it's in harmony. And that idea is applied here to the Republic in the same way that the body ought to be in harmony. If the body's out of harmony, then we would see something like giving in to baser desires so much that, say, gluttony causes one to gain weight. So an extremely obese person demonstrates a disharmony in the body, which is a result of a defect in the soul, the vice of gluttony. That would be unjust in the sense of the individual being disharmonious. And so that's how the connection is made across these different, seemingly different areas of life, right? Mathematics to music to social order to the individual body to the universe. So in the same way, the universe is not out of order. You don't have Earth, expanding into taking over the stellar heavens. Earth is what it is and stays what it is. The heavens are what they are and stay what they are. These are in order. Hades is what it is and stays what it is. Right? Earth doesn't suddenly become Hades. And that's because the order is always maintained. And so therefore the ideal republic should have order at all times maintained. And crucial to this is this hieratic, triadic structure of the masses, the guardians, and the philosopher king. But it is interesting to point out that the noble lie does sound quite similar to the noble lie of our day, which is attempting to impose this green religion upon the world, where now even the Pope is exalting the UN and UNESCO and the green agenda. This is the new religion. Mother Earth gave you your life, therefore worship Mother Earth, or you will be out of balance and the state should perhaps, cut you off, depopulate. This seems to be where they want to take things, and it's important to point out that it's nothing new. It's the old lie of Plato's Republic in terms of the exoteric religion of the state. The exact same. Gaia, Mother Earth, gave birth to you. So, for those who would seek to be wiser, don't fall for old ancient scams. Don't fall for the lie that Gaia is who birthed you and that joining some sort of UN green agenda, buying into any of that baloney is going to get you anywhere. It's also interesting that the mythology seems to apply in different senses to different strata. And this is something that we see explicit in Brave New World, which I will eventually get to in an audio and article form, because Brave New World is very much modeled on the Republic. Interesting. So good and bad in Plato. Good and bad. Reason versus irrationality. Can we have an ideal state? I don't think so. Not in this life. And it is the driving force of revolutions in history, revolutionary movements, based on idealism. And idealism oftentimes informed by the Republic, that have mistakenly operated under the impression that you can impose this in our world. Right? And this is why it leads to such bloody chaos, all these stupid revolutions. The world does not operate in a rational fashion. You can't force people to be rational. Now, of course, I think Plato ultimately knew this, but this still leaves open the question of what exactly is the rational state. And ultimately, there will have to be some form of hierarchy and enforcement. Plato seems to reason precisely because the mass, the democracy, the demos, the people, they're not rational. They're based on appetitive desires, right? Desires of the appetites. That's what they're motivated by. And they're never going to be motivated by the same things that the guardian class is motivated by, because it's a higher class. And you just can't force people to be more than what they are. And it's that false perspective of thinking that you can force people to be more than what they are that leads to so many bloody revolutions in history, where then the revolutionary leaders come to despise the proletariat because they expect out of the proletariat, working class, the very things they're incapable of doing. This is the madness and illogic of the revolutionary thought. At least the true believers of the revolution. Most of the time, revolutions are, of course, funded by foreign powers to destabilize a different power. But the idiot revolutionaries that buy into the idealism and the ideology, they're mad because they can't force these people to buy into all these high-minded ideals. And so, as the note says in mine, this leads to the argument for the division of the soul into three parts: appetitive, spirit, and rational, corresponding to the three major classes of the Republic: producers, guardians, rulers. And that will be our triad, modeled after monad-dyad triad. Although in that sense, we wouldn't say that the masses don't correspond to the monad, right? They're because they're irrational. So it's not that the masses correspond necessarily to a specific point on the triangle. It's rather that this triad just seems to be continuous in nature. That would be, I think, Plato's argumentation. So this has been Book 3, fascinating treatise. Book 4, we will move on to further discussions of this class structure. I'll touch more on how this influenced further revolutionaries throughout history into the future. We'll get more into eugenics, Plato's mention of culling the herd, and we'll have discussions of the oracle at Delphi. Will this continue to be in the ideal republic? Yes, it will. Why will that be? Well, we'll see. We'll get more into the tripartite view of the human being: reason and the rational, appetitive and irrational, being and non-being, flux. These are going to all come into play in books 4 and 5. And again, why so much of this population control? Well, we will see. And even infanticide. Yes, infanticide. What about feminism? Is there feminism in Plato's Republic? Well, you'll just have to wait to see. That concludes Book 3. Thank you for listening. This has been jaysanalysis.com.